Ottoman scouts crossed into Safavid lands and found villages where the wheat fields were burning, but the fire burned cold. Horses refused to go further. Men spoke of music drifting from empty mosques, and the smell of sulfur under the soil. The year is 1514. Across the highlands of northwestern Persia, something moves that should not move. Ottoman scouts enter Safavid territory and find villages abandoned in haste, bread still warm in ovens, doors left swinging on hinges. The wheat fields are burning, but when the men draw close, they feel no heat. The flames dance blue and green, casting no smoke, consuming nothing. Horses scream and refuse to advance. Veteran soldiers who have seen death in a dozen forms cross themselves and whisper prayers their grandfathers taught them. From empty mosques comes the sound of singing, low and rhythmic, in no language any man recognizes. When they dig into the soil seeking water, the earth smells of sulfur and old blood. The scouts return to Sultan Selim with reports that make no sense, and he orders them flogged for cowardice until an entire company swears the same tale. Something is wrong in the lands of Shah Ismail, something that predates armies and empires, something that waits in the dust of Chaldiran. The first patrol disappears on the night of July the 23rd. 12 men, all experienced riders, all veterans of campaigns in the Balkans and Egypt. They ride into a valley where smoke rises without fire, and they do not return. Search parties find their horses 3 days later, standing in perfect formation, still saddled, still bridled, but riderless. The animals refuse to be led away. They stand facing east toward the rising sun, trembling, their eyes rolled back white with terror. When soldiers try to force them to move, the horses drop dead on the spot, all 12 within minutes of each other, with no visible wounds and no explanation. The bodies of the riders are never found. By August, the reports multiply. Entire companies swear they see figures moving through the abandoned villages, shapes that walk like men but cast shadows that move independently, shadows that reach and grasp and pull at the edges of firelight. Water sources turn foul overnight. Wells that have sustained villages for generations suddenly run dry or fill with liquid that smells like rotting flowers and burns the throat. Compasses spin uselessly. Maps become unreliable as landmarks shift position between sunrise and sunset. The Janissaries, who fear nothing mortal, begin to mutter about turning back. They are the Sultan's elite infantry, men who have stormed walls and broken armies across 3 continents, and they whisper in their tents about ancient things stirring in the Persian earth. They speak of the land itself rejecting their presence, of soil that moves underfoot like something breathing, of nights when the stars disappear and the darkness becomes absolute and hungry. The imams traveling with the army refuse to conduct evening prayers facing east toward Mecca because east means facing deeper into Safavid lands, and they claim the very direction has become corrupted. Sultan Selim hears all of this and believes none of it. He is a man who trusts only in steel and gunpowder and the will to use both without hesitation. He orders any man caught spreading tales of supernatural occurrence to be executed for undermining morale. 3 soldiers hang before the army stops talking openly, but the fear does not diminish. It simply goes quiet, festering in silence, spreading through the ranks like plague. And still the army marches east, because Selim the Grim has decided that Shah Ismail must die, and what Selim decides becomes reality regardless of what stands in the way. Even if what stands in the way is something that has been waiting in those mountains since before Islam, since before Christ, since the first men learned to make fire and wondered what watched them from the darkness beyond the flames. Shah Ismail I of Persia is 27 years old and believes himself immortal. Not metaphorically, not as poetry, but as cold fact carved into his soul by visions that came to him when he was 7, visions of light pouring through his veins and voices speaking his name in languages older than Arabic or Persian. He claims descent from the 7th Imam, hidden since the year 874, whose bloodline carries the spark of the divine made flesh. His followers, the Kizilbash redheads named for the crimson turbans they wind 12 times around their skulls, worship him as the living manifestation of God on earth. They do not fight for land or gold or the promise of spoils. They fight because their prophet king commands it, and death in his service is not death but transformation, a passage into realms of light that Ismail describes in verses that make grown warriors weep. When he was 14, he led 300 horsemen against an army of 30,001, not through tactics but through sheer impossible fortune that his enemies later called witchcraft. By the time he seized the throne at age 14, he had already survived 6 assassination attempts, 3 poisonings, and a fall from a cliff that should have killed him but left him without a scratch. Ismail writes poetry that speaks of worlds beyond worlds, of gates that open when enough blood soaks the ground, of ancient fires that sleep beneath the mountains of Azerbaijan waiting for the right voice to wake them. His verses circulate through the empire in whispered recitations, lines that speak of threads connecting all living things, of how a king who knows the secret names can pull those threads and make reality bend. His court whispers that he does not sleep, that servants posted outside his chambers hear him speaking through the night in dialogues with presences no one else can see. They whisper that he spends hours alone in rooms deep beneath the palace where the walls weep moisture that burns the skin on contact, where the air smells of copper and smoke, where symbols are carved into the floor in patterns that hurt to look at directly. Guards who have glimpsed inside report candles that burn with flames of green and blue, mirrors that reflect rooms that are not there, and the Shah himself standing motionless with his eyes rolled back to whites, his mouth moving without sound. His generals have watched him walk into battle without armor, standing in plain sight of enemy archers who fire volley after volley, and seen arrows curve away as if deflected by invisible hands or turned aside by winds that blow only around his body. They have seen wounded men touch the hem of his robe and rise healed, gashes closing, fevers breaking, poison sweating out through the skin in black streams. After the Battle of Sherer, a soldier with his intestines spilling from a sword wound crawled to Ismail's feet and the Shah placed one hand on his head, and witnesses swear the wound closed from the inside out, flesh knitting itself together while the man screamed in languages he did not know. Some call these miracles. Others, standing further back in the crowd, call them something else entirely and make signs against evil when the Shah's gaze passes over them. They have also seen the things he does to prisoners in the dark hours before dawn, rituals that are never discussed in daylight but that leave the stone floors of the lower dungeon stained with marks that will not wash away no matter how much water the servants pour. Entire companies of captured enemy soldiers have disappeared into those chambers and never emerged, no bodies returned for burial, no bones found, only silence and stains that seem to move when no one is looking directly at them. The court physicians who are summoned afterward to examine the Shah refuse to speak of what they see, but their hands shake for days and some resign their positions and flee to distant provinces. One left a journal that was found after his death, pages filled with drawings of human forms torn open in ways that anatomy cannot explain, of symbols burned into flesh that continue to glow hours after death, of the Shah standing over it all with his eyes reflecting a light source that was not in the room. The journal was burned by religious authorities, but copies survive, hidden in private libraries, read by men who want to understand what kind of power their prophet king truly commands and whether the price of his divinity might be higher than any empire should pay. Sultan Selim I is called Yavuz, the Grim, and the name is not poetry but warning. He has murdered his way to the Ottoman throne through the bodies of his brothers, his nephews, his cousins, and anyone foolish enough to question his right to rule. When he took power in the year 1512, he invited his brothers to a feast and had them strangled with silk cords between the appetizers and the main course. Their sons, some barely old enough to walk, followed them into death before the dessert was served. He watched it all with eyes that never blinked, sipping wine while the palace executioners worked with professional efficiency. This is not cruelty for its own sake but calculated necessity, because Selim believes in one truth above all others, that the empire can have only one master, and mercy is the luxury of men who do not understand what power costs. He is a man of absolute certainty in a world drowning in doubt, a Sunni Orthodox believer so rigid in his faith that he makes the ulama scholars nervous. He sees the Shia Safavids not as rival princes or competing empires but as heretics who poison the faith from within, as corruption made flesh, as a cancer that will metastasize unless cut out at the root. His hatred for Shah Ismail is not political but theological, not strategic but spiritual, and it burns in him like fever that will not break. He has dreams that wake him screaming in the dead hours before dawn. Dreams of a red tide drowning Anatolia, of Persian horsemen riding through the streets of Istanbul, of his empire collapsing into fire and his children's heads mounted on spikes. Dreams where the sky splits open and something ancient and hungry peers through, drawn by the prayers of the Kizilbash heretics who worship their Shah as God. His advisors beg him to wait, to consolidate his power, to avoid fighting Persia and Europe simultaneously. The Mamluks in Egypt grow restless. The Hungarians test the northern borders. Venice watches from across the sea, waiting for any sign of weakness. Fighting on 2 fronts is madness, they whisper, fighting on 3 fronts is suicide. Selim ignores them all with the contempt of a man who has never lost. He marches east in the spring of 1514 with 60,000 men, the largest army the Ottoman Empire has fielded in a generation. Janissaries with their distinctive white caps and matchlock muskets, men who have known no family but the corps since childhood. Sipahi cavalry on horses bred for endurance and speed, warriors whose grandfathers rode with Mehmed the Conqueror. And the artillery, the pride of Ottoman engineering, bronze cannons that take 20 oxen each to move, guns that can shatter fortress walls and turn cavalry charges into abattoirs. But as the army crosses into Safavid lands, the wrongness begins. Subtle at first, easy to dismiss as coincidence or imagination. Wells that were full of sweet water yesterday are bone dry today, and when engineers dig deeper, they find only sand that smells of sulfur. Compass needles spin without settling, turning in lazy circles as if North itself has abandoned these lands. Men wake at dawn to find their tent stakes driven into ground that was solid earth at sunset but has become soft as ash by morning, stakes that pull free with no resistance, leaving holes that seem to go down farther than any stake was driven. The horses grow skittish, refusing to graze on grass that looks healthy but tastes, the grooms swear, like metal and rot. Sentries report lights moving on the horizon after dark, blue and green flames that dance but give no heat, that vanish when approached but reappear in the corner of vision. The imam traveling with the army, a man of 70 years who has accompanied a dozen campaigns, refuses to leave his wagon. He claims the very air tastes of jinn and old sin, that the land itself has been corrupted by the heretic Shah's blasphemous prayers. He performs purification rituals 3 times a day instead of the prescribed once, and his hands shake when he handles the Quran. Younger clerics whisper that he has gone mad, but the veterans, the men who have seen things in distant wars that do not fit into reports, watch him with worried eyes and check their amulets before sleeping. Selim hears every report, dismisses every concern, and orders the march to continue at increased pace. Because stopping means admitting fear, and fear is the one enemy he will never acknowledge, the one foe he cannot strangle with silk cords or blast apart with artillery. So the army moves east, 60,000 men marching into lands where the very earth seems to reject their presence, where water will not quench thirst and compasses will not point home, toward a battle that waits like an open mouth on the plain of Chaldiran. They meet on the plain of Chaldiran on August the 23rd, 1514, as the sun rises blood-red through dust that should not be there on a windless morning. The sky itself seems wrong, too heavy, pressing down on the earth like a lid on a cauldron about to boil over. The Persian army numbers perhaps 40,000, all cavalry, no infantry, no guns, because Shah Ismail has declared that faith needs no cannons and the righteous need no walls of shields. The Kizilbash warriors wear red turbans, 12 feet of cloth wound around caps of steel, and they sit their horses in perfect silence, waiting for their god-king to speak. They have fasted for 3 days, drunk only water blessed by their Shah's own hands, and they believe with certainty that burns brighter than the sun that today they cannot die, not truly, not in any way that matters. Across the field, the Ottoman army stands in formation that took 2 hours to arrange, a crescent of infantry 3 ranks deep with artillery positioned in the gaps, bronze cannons that gleam like captured stars, each one blessed by imams who prayed over the metal as it cooled. Sultan Selim sits on a black warhorse and watches the Persian lines with eyes that have not blinked in minutes, and his hand rests on his sword hilt with the grip of a man holding on to sanity itself. The charge begins not with a trumpet call but with a sound like singing, thousands of voices rising in unison, chanting verses from poems Shah Ismail himself has written, words about divine fire and transformation and the shattering of the veil between worlds. The Kizilbash come forward at a trot, then a canter, then a full gallop, and they come at the Ottoman lines like a prayer made flesh, like a wave of red and steel and absolute conviction. Shah Ismail leads from the front on a white horse that seems to glow in the strange morning light, his sword catching brilliance that appears brighter than the sun should cast, and men swear later that they saw no shadow fall from him, as if he had become something that light passes through rather than strikes. For the first hour, it seems the madness might be true, that faith might triumph over gunpowder and tactics, that devotion might bend the rules that govern steel and flesh. The Ottoman muskets fire in disciplined volleys, 3 ranks rotating, load and fire, and the Kizilbash charge again and again into that wall of lead and smoke, and they do not break. Men with 3 bullets in their chests keep riding, their eyes wide and bright with something beyond pain. Warriors who should be dead from blood loss fight on with smiles on their faces, laughing as they swing their curved swords, cutting down janissaries who stumble backward in confusion and mounting horror. The Ottoman line begins to buckle. Gaps appear where men have fallen or fled or simply frozen in terror at what they are witnessing. Selim rides behind his troops screaming orders that are lost in the chaos, and his face is the face of a man watching his certainties crumble. Then the artillery opens fire. Bronze cannons loaded with chain shot and iron balls, each gun firing in sequence, creating a rolling thunder that drowns out the Persians singing and replaces it with the sound of metal tearing through bone and horse and faith itself. The mathematics of war reassert themselves with brutal clarity. You cannot charge guns on horseback, no matter how deep your faith, no matter what miracles you believe protect you, no matter what promises your Shah has whispered in your ears. The first volley kills 300 riders in a single instant. The second volley kills 400 more. The third volley breaks the charge entirely, turning the red wave into scattered fragments, individual riders wheeling in confusion, trying to reform, trying to understand how the impossible has become possible, how they can be bleeding and dying when they were promised they could not. The Persian cavalry breaks against the Ottoman center like water against stone, beautiful and terrible and ultimately futile. By noon, 15,000 Kizilbash lie dead in the dust, their red turbans unwinding in the wind like rivers of blood, their horses screaming and thrashing among the bodies. Shah Ismail flees the field with an arrow in his shoulder and the first doubt he has ever known burning in his mind like acid eating through certainty. He is still alive, still mounted, still moving, but something has shattered inside him that will never repair. His generals surround him and pull him toward the east, toward safety, toward a future he no longer believes in. Behind them, the Ottoman soldiers stand among the dead and understand that they have won, but they do not cheer. They stand in silence and stare at the corpses that are sinking slowly into the earth, and they wonder what price they will pay for breaking a god. The battle ends at sunset, but the dying does not. Ottoman soldiers move across the field of Chaldiran as victors always do, stripping the dead of armor and weapons, cutting purses from belts, prying rings from fingers still warm. Then the wrongness begins. A janissary reaches for a fallen Kizilbash warrior and freezes, his hand hovering above the body. The corpse is sinking. Not settling into the dust as dead men do, but sinking, pulled down into earth that has gone soft as water. Within minutes, the body has disappeared entirely, leaving only a depression in the ground and the smell of turned soil. Another soldier calls out in alarm. More bodies, dozens of them, hundreds, melting into the plain as if the earth is swallowing its children home. The looters back away, their hands empty, their faces pale. They are men who have walked through slaughterhouses without flinching, but this is something else, something that makes their ancestors' superstitions rise in their throats like bile. The wounded Persians are worse. Ottoman officers move among them seeking intelligence, asking about supply lines and garrison strengths. But the answers that come back are not answers. A Kizilbash warrior with his legs crushed beneath a dead horse speaks in a voice too deep for his young throat, speaking of gates that opened for one shining moment and have now closed again. Another, bleeding from a dozen wounds, whispers about fires that sleep beneath the mountains of Azerbaijan, banked but not extinguished, waiting for the next king who believes himself divine enough to wake them. A third laughs and laughs until blood runs from his mouth, saying only that the waiting will outlast empires, that stone remembers what flesh forgets, that Chaldiran will hunger again when these conquerors are dust and their grandchildren's grandchildren are forgotten. The translators refuse to continue. Even hardened interrogators step back from men whose eyes have gone black from lid to lid. The looting parties return to camp as the stars come out, carrying silk and gold and jeweled daggers worth a year's wages. They also carry something else. By morning, a third of them are burning with fever. Their skin turns hot enough to blister at the touch, yet they shiver as if freezing. The camp physicians bleed them, dose them with herbs, pray over them. Nothing helps. They die within 3 days, all of them, their last words incomprehensible, spoken in languages that sound like Arabic played backwards, like Persian melted and reformed into shapes the human tongue should not make. The wells go bad on the second day. Water that was sweet at dawn tastes bitter by noon, metallic, wrong. By evening it has turned red, not the red of blood but darker, thicker, like rust dissolved in darkness. By the third morning, the wells are dry, every one of them, as if something beneath the ground has drunk them empty. The Ottoman army sits in a land crossed by 3 rivers, and they are dying of thirst. Soldiers fill their water skins from the streams and watch the water turn black before they can lift it to their lips. Horses refuse to drink. Men who try anyway vomit until they can only lie curled on the ground, whimpering. Sultan Selim gives the order to withdraw on the 3rd day of August, year 1514. He calls it a strategic redeployment. His generals know it for what it is. Retreat. Flight from an enemy that cannot be killed because it is not alive, cannot be defeated because it was never truly fighting. The army marches west, leaving their dead unburied because the ground will not accept shovels, leaving their victory unclaimed because the land will not be occupied. They leave fast, glancing over their shoulders, and they do not stop until the wrongness fades from the air and the compass needles point true again. The local villagers return when the dust settles and the armies have faded into memory. They find a battlefield transformed. Where the Ottoman artillery stood, the ground has turned to black glass, smooth and cold and reflecting nothing. They try to plant crops there. Nothing grows. Not that season, not the next, not for 7 generations of planting and prayer. The glass remains, a scar that will not heal. And on certain nights, when the moon is dark and the wind blows from the mountains, travelers report lights moving across the plain. Blue flames and green, dancing like fire but casting no heat, moving in patterns that suggest purpose, intelligence, hunger. The villagers do not investigate. They know better. They build their homes far from Chaldiran and they do not let their children play near the black glass. Because some ground, once fed, develops an appetite. And some hungers, once woken, never truly sleep again. Sultan Selim the Grim enters Istanbul on the 1st day of October, 1514, and the city erupts in celebration. Banners proclaim the crushing of the Persian heretics. Poets compose verses about the triumph of Orthodox faith over Safavid blasphemy. Gold flows through the treasury, plundered from Tabriz and a dozen smaller cities. The Janissaries parade through streets lined with cheering crowds, their weapons gleaming, their faces hard with pride. But those who stand close to the Sultan notice something the celebrating masses do not. His hands shake when he thinks no one is watching. He flinches at sudden sounds. At night, servants hear him pacing his chambers until dawn, speaking to himself in a voice too low to make out words. When his advisors ask him to describe the great victory at Chaldiran for the official chronicles, he stares at them with eyes that have seen something they have not, and he says only this: write that we won, write that the heretics fled, write nothing else. His court historian, a man who has recorded every detail of every campaign for 20 years, is found dead 3 weeks later. The official cause is fever, but there are no marks of sickness on his body, only a smell of sulfur in the room where he died, and pages of his private journal burned to ash on his writing desk. After that, no one asks the Sultan about Chaldiran again. The battle becomes a footnote in Ottoman history, a victory mentioned in passing, its details lost to silence and fear. 1,500 miles to the east, Shah Ismail sits in his palace at Tabriz and stares at walls that no longer weep. The wound in his shoulder has healed, but something else has broken that will never mend. For 13 years, he believed himself the living bridge between heaven and earth, the promised one whose coming would transform the world. His followers worshipped him not as a king but as divinity incarnate. He walked through arrows and emerged untouched. He spoke words that made grown men weep with ecstasy. He opened doors that should have stayed closed and called down fires that should have stayed buried. And then at Chaldiran, the Ottoman guns fired, and his warriors died like any other men. They bled. They screamed. They fell and did not rise. The divine protection he had promised them proved to be nothing more than faith and flesh tears so easily under iron and lead. He writes poetry now, sitting alone in chambers where courtiers are forbidden to enter. The verses speak of silence where there should be voices, of ash where there should be fire, of doors he once opened with a whisper that now will not move no matter how hard he pushes. He never leads an army again. He rules for another 10 years, but he rules as a man, not a god, and everyone can see the difference. The Qizilbash warriors who survive Chaldiran stop wearing their red turbans 12 feet high. They stop charging into impossible odds with smiles on their faces. They become soldiers, professionals, men who understand that courage and faith cannot stop bullets. The transformation is subtle but absolute. The Safavid Empire continues for 2 more centuries after Ismail's death in 1524. It remains powerful, remains Shia, remains a force that shapes the destiny of the Islamic world. But the rituals in the dark chambers cease. No more prisoners disappear into rooms where the walls run with moisture that burns. No more nights where strange lights flicker in palace windows and servants wake screaming from dreams they cannot remember. The Shahs who follow Ismail are kings, administrators, warriors, but none of them claim to be gods. None of them speak of gates or fires or covenants with powers older than Islam itself. Persia becomes normal. And perhaps that is the greatest victory the Ottomans won at Chaldiran, not the territory gained or the army destroyed, but the breaking of whatever terrible thing had been growing in the heart of the Safavid throne. The plain of Chaldiran remains empty. Shepherds drive their flocks miles out of the way rather than cross that ground. Travelers who must pass through do so at midday, never at dawn or dusk, and never after dark. The soil where the artillery stood has turned to black glass that will not accept seed or root. 7 generations pass, then 8, then 9, and still nothing grows there. On certain nights, usually when the moon is new and the sky is black as pitch, people in nearby villages report seeing lights moving across the plain. Blue flames and green flames dancing in patterns that suggest intention, that suggest waiting. The flames cast no heat. They consume nothing. They simply move and watch and remember. Because some fires, once kindled, never truly die. They bank themselves beneath the earth, patient as mountains, waiting for the next Shah or Sultan or Emperor who believes himself more than human, who thinks he can open doors that were sealed for reasons lost to time. The fires at Chaldiran are waiting still. And they will wait forever if necessary. Because forever is all they have.